There's an old adage that says, if there's no risk, there's no reward. It's an adage that has typified Final Fantasy for over 3 decades, and it should come as no surprise that it's an adage the development team working on Final Fantasy XVI embraced wholeheartedly. They decided to hold nothing back, and just hoped that judgment would be rendered after the fruits of their labour was in the hands of consumers. That event happened almost 3 months ago, on the 22nd of June, and as the 16th mainline entry into one of the most famed video game franchises of all time, it meant Final Fantasy XVI launched with huge expectations, perhaps too huge. Throughout this video, we are going to discuss in significant detail whether or not those expectations were met. And as this is the kind of subject that can often be ruled by emotion, we will instead be adopting our typical granular style, using data where possible to filter out some of the noise and hopefully provide a more balanced perspective. To work in with that, we will also be conducting a Final Fantasy XVI consumer survey so that we can truly understand how consumers feel about the game now that the dust has settled. In the past, we have conducted surveys relating to Final Fantasy XV and the Final Fantasy VII Remake. These surveys were very methodical, and due to the quality of the data and the volume of people who took part, these surveys have even caught the attention of Square Enix. The previous iteration had almost 15,000 participants, but we'd love to smash that number this time. So if you have 5 to 10 minutes to spare, please consider clicking on the link in the description below and taking the survey. And if you could share it around to as many communities as possible, that would be much appreciated. After all, the more responses we have, the better the data, and the better the analysis will be. Now, it's pretty common knowledge that from the earliest days of the Final Fantasy franchise, the expectation was set that every mainline entry should be a standalone entry, as opposed to a continuation. This principle has always been applied to each game's narrative, as well as some of the underlying gameplay mechanics. And one of the major benefits of this approach was that the developers would not be constrained by a ton of different franchise rules that couldn't be broken. This then allowed for the creation of so many unique and magical worlds and characters. One of the major downsides, however, was that every new iteration would have the potential to ostracize those who vibed with previous entries. There's a belief that this kind of thing only really started happening in the Square Enix era, but that couldn't be further from the truth. It's more that, due to there being so many amplification platforms around now, that negativity has more room to grow, and even be wielded as a weapon. Let's take a look at Final Fantasy VII as a good example. This game has been lauded as one of the greatest ever made. Even just a few months ago, it was ranked 17th by countless experts who contributed to GQ magazine's article that was entitled The 100 Greatest Video Games of All Time, ranked by experts. The Final Fantasy VII soundtrack is also put on a pedestal, with the likes of Aerith's theme and One Winged Angel amongst some of the most famous tracks associated with the franchise, but also video games in general. Even now, 4 out of the top 5 most streamed Uematsu tracks on Spotify are from Final Fantasy VII. But when the game launched in 1997, it wasn't without its detractors. There were those who were unhappy with the choices Square had made, and how much it deviated away from what Final Fantasy had grown to become during the 16-bit era. Ken Chu, for example, noted in their review of Final Fantasy VIII for RPG Fan, which was published back in 1999, that many long-time Final Fantasy fans were somewhat disappointed with Final Fantasy VII's soundtrack. And Gene Park, a games reporter for the Washington Post, revealed on Twitter that he had been involved in a fistfight during high school that was instigated by him telling a friend that Final Fantasy VI was a superior game and that Final Fantasy VII wasn't a real Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy II can also serve as a prominent example. At the time of its release, it sold 46% more copies than the original game. It received a higher review score from Famitsu and the readers of Family Computer magazine than the original game, and it also won Famitsu's grand prize by a landslide, beating the likes of Mother and Tetris to become the first and only the third Final Fantasy game in history to receive such an accolade. As time has passed, Final Fantasy II, though, has become the black sheep of the franchise and is often derided. Whenever publications create rankings, it's not surprising to see Final Fantasy II positioned dead last. And even Hironobu Sakaguchi, the famed creator of Final Fantasy, has distanced himself from the game in more recent years. Does this mean that Final Fantasy II was a failure? No, of course not. It cannot and should not be considered anything other than a resounding success. The commercial performance of Final Fantasy II was nothing short of incredible. It far exceeded anything Square had ever published before, and beyond that, it galvanized the team by validating the unorthodox approach they had taken with its development. Were there lessons to be learned? Sure, but the team decided to champion the notion of reinvention by evolving what worked and discarding what didn't. They then sought to try and make an even better game with Final Fantasy III, and depending on how the mechanics resonated, they either succeeded or failed. There would have been people who loved the natural progression system and story-driven approach that was implemented with Final Fantasy II, and others who preferred the refocus on nameless warriors of light who could make use of an enhanced job system. This was apparent a few years after the games were published when Famitsu polled its readers. As part of a segment called "What do you hate most about Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest?", one of the questions was, which is the most boring game in their respective franchise? The original Final Fantasy received 16% of the votes, Final Fantasy II received 47%, and Final Fantasy III received 22%. But there were also 15% of respondents who said that none of them were boring. This poll only served to highlight that consumers want different things. Mechanics that appeal to one person may not appeal to another. Put plainly, no matter how much someone may love something, it's just as easy for someone else to hate it. And when it comes to giving opinions, unfortunately, the hate is what gets the time in the spotlight, and to fight against that hate requires strong conviction. As highlighted by Neiman, who conducted a study on the subject earlier this year, simply adding a negative word like harm, heartbroken, ugly, troubling, or angry will lead to an article or video generating 2.3% more traffic. Conversely, adding positive words such as benefit, laughed, pretty, favourite, or kind can lead to the opposite happening. It actively dissuaded people from reading the article. This has incentivized the creation of negative content, as it generates more traffic and leads to more engagement. And what we're seeing right now is this philosophy at its absolute peak. But it's also being fueled by what feels like a Final Fantasy-based paradox. The franchise stands on the shoulders of 5 games that are widely considered to be some of the greatest games ever made. As denoted by Wikipedia's criteria, to receive this designation, a game needs to have appeared on at least 6 separate best or game of all time lists that are produced by different publications as chosen by that publication's editorial staff. These 5 games are Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Final Fantasy X. They are the reason why many of us are still interested in Final Fantasy today, but their success created an expectation that every new mainline entry should be attempting to match their quality. But during that era, we were spoiled. For any new game to achieve what those games did is a tall order, and we now find ourselves in a situation where if a game doesn't succeed in meeting the high bar that's been set, it's considered a disappointment, a failure, and in some cases, tarnished with the brush of being classified as not a real Final Fantasy game. That then brings us onto the curious case of Final Fantasy XVI. Almost as soon as the game was announced, the aforementioned paradox was clear as day. The Awakening trailer was viewed almost 11 million times. This was more than the individual reveals of the Resident Evil 4 remake, Jedi Survivor, and even The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And it showcased the strength, power, and general intrigue that still surrounded the Final Fantasy brand. In a bold move, the trailer had a focus on visuals that prioritized the use of in-game assets, a move that was made to assure fans that the game had not been announced too soon and that it would be releasing much earlier than they realized. It was meant to be a positive move, but the trailer was not well received. It was a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Some of the harshest critics came from the existing fanbase, with those who were introduced to mainline Final Fantasy offerings either via Final Fantasy X itself or an earlier entry being the harshest. The pandemic would then have a severe impact on Square Enix's capacity to respond to this sentiment, and at the end of 2021, the game's producer, Naoki Yoshida, would end up issuing a statement to explain the situation and assure fans that 2022 will be very different. From that point onwards, it was full steam ahead. Final Fantasy XVI had reached top speed, and in the noble words of Barrett Wallace, there weren't no getting off of this train we on. The game's first previews were published towards the start of 2023, and they were resoundingly positive. but there was still a general air of uncertainty. Gamers just wanted to go hands-on themselves to see if the previews were legitimate with their praise. That opportunity came not too long after the game's prologue went live as a demo, and Final Fantasy XVI was all that anyone could talk about. Streamers were quick to capitalize. Within hours of the prologue going live, there were already hundreds of channels streaming their playthroughs. Peak viewership came at 8 PM on the 12th of June, when almost 80,000 people were collectively watching people play the demo across more than 550 channels. This then translated over to YouTube. Everyone was desperate to see how their favourite personalities responded to the demo, and videos were receiving hundreds of thousands of views and even sometimes millions of views. We still don't know how much this affected Western pre-orders, but there was a reference in Japan. Prior to the release of the demo, Final Fantasy XVI was seeing modest pre-order returns in that region, and this can be verified by a local retailer based in the Nagata prefecture called COMG, who published their pre-order data. Prior to the demo launching, which was 11 days before launch, Final Fantasy XVI had 87 points. Given the strength of the Final Fantasy brand in Japan, it was well short of expectations. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, for example, was at 580 points 11 days before its launch, and Fire Emblem Engage was at 148. Between the demo being released and the eventual launch of Final Fantasy XVI, this number shot from 87 to 167. They had received almost double the amount of pre-orders in the 10 days leading up to launch than they had in the time since pre-orders were made available. Promotional efforts also kicked into gear. It was a huge Final Fantasy XVI event hosted in Los Angeles that was streamed worldwide, and a similar event took place in Tokyo. Ben Starr was also an absolute trooper. Alongside attending the live event in North America, he produced content with Easy Allies, Jinx TV, Kinda Funny Games, GameStop, PlayStation Access, and the Friends Per Second crew. And this only helped to amplify the hype that was building. Those 2 weeks were pretty incredible, and they highlighted that there was a significant amount of intrigue within the wider gaming community around Final Fantasy XVI now that the cat was out of the proverbial bag. As we live in the world we do, that intrigue then shifted over to how the game would perform upon launch, both in terms of how critics would rate it and how well it would sell. In the initial sense, reviews were, for the most part, very positive. When isolating reviews to those that were published at the embargo, Final Fantasy XVI was awarded a score of 89%, with 21% of reviews giving it a perfect score. This was higher than the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which sat on 87.7% after that review embargo had lifted, and it would position Final Fantasy XVI as one of the best reviewed PlayStation 5 games of all time. This review score would then drop down to 88 on OpenCritic as more reviews trickled in, but 88% was, and still is, an incredible score. And it's amongst the 98th percentile of all games ever reviewed that feature on OpenCritic. It also places Final Fantasy XVI on par with current generation games such as Horizon Forbidden West, Diablo 4, and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. And when going back into the annals of the previous generation, it's the same score as games such as It Takes Two, Devil May Cry 5, Cuphead, and Fallout 4. Final Fantasy XVI has also received more critical praise than powerhouse games such as Resident Evil Village, Death Stranding, Ghost of Tsushima, Control, and Stray. When thinking about where the Final Fantasy franchise has been over the past 2 decades, it's also a very favourable comparison. Review scores of the past few mainline entries have landed in the low 80s, and mainline sequels and spin-offs have fallen as low as 66%. Sure, it's unlikely that Final Fantasy XVI will win Game of the Year. After all, there have been plenty of other fantastic games released throughout 2023, but it may still sneak a few nominations, and if it does, those nominations would not be undeserved. Final Fantasy XVI should, however, still have strong representation within some of the other award categories due to its stellar soundtrack and phenomenal voice acting. Between all of these elements, it's difficult to call Final Fantasy XVI anything other than a critical success. And alongside the Final Fantasy VII Remake, it points to there being a more positive trend when it comes to the overall quality of Final Fantasy games being produced at the moment. Looking within the fanbase, there will, of course, be detractors. Nobody likes to be hyped about something that they then just don't vibe with when playing it. But that's the peril of being a Final Fantasy fan. And the beauty is that even though there will be detractors, there will also be tons of advocates created too. The Final Fantasy XVI subreddit, for example, has only continued to grow post-launch, and that's not something that would happen if there was mass hatred for the game. There have also been almost 700 individual threads created across a variety of different subreddits where someone has declared that Final Fantasy XVI is the best game since something else. In most cases, that something else has been Final Fantasy X, but in other cases, it's been more abstract games such as Elden Ring. Those advocates are then useful for spreading positive sentiment via word of mouth, but detractors can also spread negative sentiment, and this creates an interesting struggle. This is perhaps best demonstrated by the volume of review bombs on sites such as Metacritic due to there being so much anger about Final Fantasy XVI's status as a PlayStation 5 exclusive. But now that time has passed and the initial anger has subsided, a more accurate picture has started to be painted. That then brings us on to sales, everyone's favourite subject. Nobody quite knew where Final Fantasy XVI was going to land, not least because it was the first mainline Final Fantasy game for 7 years. It's also important to remember that when Hajime Tabata took on the role of remoulding Final Fantasy XV, internal expectations were that the game would struggle to sell more than 5 million copies worldwide across its lifetime. There was a belief that Final Fantasy brand equity was at an all-time low, and this had been highlighted by the diminishing returns associated with Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels, and the dire performance of Final Fantasy XIV when it launched back in 2010. Regardless, thanks to a combination of genius pre- and post-launch marketing, Final Fantasy XV would go on to sell more than 10 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling games in the history of the franchise, and it highlighted what could happen if the sleeping giant were to be awakened. The first indication of Final Fantasy XVI sales performance came from the United Kingdom. We learnt that the game had topped the weekly sales charts, and the Entertainment and Retail Association would add some flavour to this by revealing that 31,400 physical copies had been sold at an average cost of £68.37 per disc, or around $86. Chris Dring from Games Industry Biz was quick to point out that even though this meant Final Fantasy XVI had generated £2.1 million, it had also sold 74% less physical copies than Final Fantasy XV. This painted the performance of Final Fantasy XVI in a very negative light, and while it was factually true, it was also missing a crucial piece of information: digital sales. Over the past 3 years, there has been a huge change in consumer behaviour when it comes to purchasing games. And taking it further, whereas back in 2016 the vast majority of people purchased physical goods, that simply doesn't reflect how consumers purchase games anymore. We would later learn that 56% of Final Fantasy XVI's UK sales were digital. This inflated the number of copies sold from 31,400 to 71,400, and this would then grow to approximately 88,600 by the end of its second week on sale. Isolating to 2023, this positioned Final Fantasy XVI as the 5th biggest retail launch of the year in the United Kingdom, with the 4 games that performed better either being sequels to existing properties that were well regarded or associated to huge multimedia franchises. When looking for more of an internal comparison, after 2 weeks, Final Fantasy XVI would see 36% less sales than the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and these results were replicated across Europe. However, as Games Industry Biz also noted, it wasn't quite an apples-to-apples comparison. Final Fantasy XVI launched at the end of a very congested and competitive period. And not just that, the 2 AAA games that launched only a few weeks prior had a huge focus on persistent play by adopting a games-as-a-service model. By the time Final Fantasy XVI launched, the 2 games were being watched by a combined average audience of over 150,000 people, split across almost 3,500 Twitch channels. Further to that, Games Industry Biz also noted that the PlayStation 5 install base is nowhere near the same as the PlayStation 4 install base was when the 7 Remake launched. Japan would be the next market to reveal sales figures. For years, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy were 2 of the strongest brands in the Japanese video gaming landscape. Each would comfortably sell millions within their launch windows, and this trend was maintained for many years. But whereas Dragon Quest has continued to sell very well in its home region, in part due to the pragmatic approach Square Enix has taken to which console the mainline installments release on, Final Fantasy has not. First week sales of Final Fantasy IX through 13 were relatively stable, but the Final Fantasy 13 sequels did not post first week sales that were anywhere near what had been seen with 10-2. and those poor first week sales then carried over to Final Fantasy XV, which saw the majority of its sales come from overseas markets. It would be easy to suggest that this was all down to a general brand decline, but by focusing on Final Fantasy in isolation, you only get half the story. PlayStation is also not the same powerhouse it once was in Japan, and even though Final Fantasy XV did not post jaw-dropping first week sales in comparison to the franchise's illustrious past, it still stands as the third biggest PlayStation 4 launch in history in Japan, sitting only behind Dragon Quest XI and Monster Hunter World. In the generation prior, Final Fantasy XIII was the only game released on the PlayStation 3 to sell more than 1 million copies in its launch week. And despite the diminished returns, Final Fantasy XIII-2 would also end up as the fourth fastest selling game on the system, beating the likes of Metal Gear Solid 4, Tales of Xillia, and Resident Evil 5. The major difference was whereas Final Fantasy XIII was the shining light of the PlayStation 3 era, able to sell well despite the dwindling market share of the PlayStation, Final Fantasy XV and the 7 Remake were not able to do the same. Final Fantasy XVI would then post first week sales of 336,027. On face value, this looked like a huge drop in comparison to Final Fantasy XV and the 7 Remake, but it was again missing that crucial piece of information: digital sales. Unlike in the UK, where we learned that the ratio was 56%, in Japan, the percentage of digital sales has not been revealed. However, it can be inferred based on information found within Square Enix's investor reports. Square Enix first started reporting the split between digital and physical sales at the end of their 2017 fiscal year. As part of the classification, they would include all digital sales, including downloadable content, expansions, and new episodes of episodic games. Even with that, at this point, 85% of their sales were still physical. Over the next few years, that percentage would continue to decrease, lowering down to 69% by the end of their 2019 fiscal year. Then, the pandemic hit. By the end of their 2020 fiscal year, the split was almost 50-50, and since then, two patterns have started to emerge. Whenever expansions for Final Fantasy XIV and Dragon Quest X release, the percentage of digital sales jumps to around 75%. Whenever they don't, the percentage of digital sales settles at around 58 to 59%. In the case of Final Fantasy XVI, during the most recent earnings report, the percentage of digital sales was actually 74%. But the Pixel Remaster series was also released on the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch during this quarter, and as they were pretty much digital only, this would have inflated the figure. Based on that, it's much safer to go for a nice round 60%. If that's the case, then Final Fantasy XVI sold around 560,000 digital copies, and that would take the first week sales up to a more respectable 896,072 copies sold. Japan is also the only major region that publishes consistent sales data. Based on this, we can see how many copies are sold week on week, and this continues until a game drops out of the top 40. In its second week, Final Fantasy XVI sold 37,736 physical copies, an 89% drop. This seemed quite severe, but it's actually par for the course when it comes to Final Fantasy games. The majority of copies are almost always sold in that first week. Based on how sales have trended over the past 10 weeks in Japan, it's safe to assume that around 1.1 million copies of the game have been sold. And in the context of how well the PlayStation is doing right now in that region, selling 1.1 million copies is nothing short of astounding. It's a success on an almost unparalleled scale. To put this into context, the first week physical sales of Final Fantasy XVI were more than the PlayStation 5 launches of Elden Ring, Resident Evil 4 Remake, Gran Turismo 7, and Hogwarts Legacy combined. The last major region is then the United States. This is the only major region where concrete sales data isn't revealed, but we can at least gain some kind of idea around performance from Circana. Unlike other regions, Circana only releases monthly data, but they do combine the majority of physical and digital sales. Of the major games to release in June, Final Fantasy XVI came second only to Diablo 4, and based on its pre-orders and sales from the tail end of the month, it became the 9th best-selling game of the year in just over a week. In July, it dropped down to 5th in the rankings and retained its position as the 9th best-selling game in the United States. When looking at downloads, as shared by PlayStation, Final Fantasy XVI was the second most downloaded game in June. It then dropped down to 4th in July, ahead of Diablo 4, and 17th in August. From a global perspective, we know that all this combined means that Final Fantasy XVI shipped 3 million copies at launch, and in doing so, it became the fastest selling PlayStation 5 exclusive, selling more copies at launch on the system than the likes of God of War Ragnarok and Horizon Forbidden West, as their sales were split between PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. That's an impressive milestone, and based on the trends seen in the market, such as the UK and Japan, it's safe to assume that Final Fantasy XVI has since surpassed 4 million copies, and that number will only continue to grow as Square Enix rolls out different initiatives. The company has also been quite coy so far. In the past, they have not been shy when saying a game has underperformed. This time, they have not done that. They have instead done the opposite, issuing a statement to try and cut off any negative sentiment that was brewing. On a more recent earnings call with investors, Square Enix also revealed that they had been expecting Final Fantasy XVI to sell between 3 to 4 million copies worldwide at launch. It delivered on the lower end. The sales were still in line with expectations. They were not disappointed with performance. There is no panic. Now, whether or not this means Final Fantasy XVI should be considered successful depends on those expectations we spoke about and how the narrative is framed. From a critical perspective, Final Fantasy XVI stands as one of the highest reviewed games by critics to release on the PlayStation 5. That is not a subjective statement. And even though there are those that dislike the game, just as there are with any other game that launches, there are also those who absolutely adore it. Just the other week, the Voices of Valisthea panel at PAX East was one of the most attended during the show, with around 3,000 fans squeezing into the packed theatre. Final Fantasy XVI has also posted strong global sales that are comparable with some of Sony's biggest PlayStation exclusive titles, and it has launched as the fastest selling PlayStation 5 exclusive. Are sales similar to what Final Fantasy has achieved in the past? Perhaps not, but time will be a better judge here, and its success will not be defined by how many copies it sold on its first day, but by its ability or inability to pick up residual sales. In this regard, there has been some doom and gloom, and media outlets have been quick to try and profit from negative sentiment. Here's one publication saying that Final Fantasy XVI sales plummeted week on week by 90%. It was actually 89%, but we'll ignore that. Here's another article though from a sister publication that positions Zelda's 82% drop in week-on-week sales as a positive. It should also be noted that games can fly under the radar and do just fine. Horizon Forbidden West is a perfect example. It posted lower initial sales than Final Fantasy XVI, but a year after launch has sold more than 8.4 million copies. It too was only the 9th best-selling game in North America during its launch year, and it wasn't in the top 20 best-selling games of 2023 by February when only a few high-impact games had launched. Yoshida has already promised that there's plenty in store too, and some of that was teased during the PAX panel. We know, for example, that 2 DLC episodes are being crafted behind the scenes. If Final Fantasy XVI had been a commercial flop and had not attracted a solid audience, it's unlikely that these would have been given the green light due to a lack of perceived return on investment. In addition, there's also the PC version. Yoshida noted that more information will be shared about the game's upcoming PC launch before the end of the year. Using the performance of Final Fantasy XV and the 7 Remake as a barometer here, the PC release should be expected to sell at least 1 million copies, perhaps even more, as chunks of the Final Fantasy XIV community have been waiting for this particular version. If that holds true, it's not difficult to see Final Fantasy XVI selling upward of 7 to 8 million copies across its lifetime, and perhaps even more depending on how well some of their secret initiatives land. Either way, we hope you've enjoyed this very granular breakdown of Final Fantasy XVI's performance to date. If you did, then please feel free to give us a like, and subscribe for more content. Also, let us know in the comments below whether you believe Final Fantasy XVI has been a success so far. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Adam Aguilara, Arguan, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Galcian D. Kujata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.